So thank you so much for being with us today. It is 1 o'clock, and so we're going to start our webinar. We also went on Facebook Live with ECF VP. So you are at Attracting Millennials webinar. ECF, the Episcopal Church Foundation, is a lay-led organization since 1949. And as you can read there, we have resources such as webinars like these to help build up lay and clergy around the church. In May and June, our focus was millennials. And if y'all read and saw our different posts, you saw that every single person was a millennial that wrote and had webinars during that time. And Sarah is part of that generation as well. And so she has some great strategies and I think some wonderful insight for us on how to attract, as we all love to do, millennials. Sarah?
Thank you, Sandra. So here's me. If you can't see my face in the video, there's a picture of me. My name is Sarah Townsend Leach. I am a ECF consultant. I've been doing capital campaign work with ECF here for about 4 years, as well as leadership consulting, working with teams of clergy and lay folk to hopefully be more effective and efficient together. I've been in the Episcopal Church my whole life. I was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, and went to St. George's. I feel like everywhere I go, I meet someone who's connected in some way to someone I know from the Episcopal Church. So I always like to throw that out there. I attended college in Memphis and got a graduate degree in nonprofit management from Indiana University. And a lot of what you'll hear in the webinar today is informed by my work in the nonprofit sector in secular nonprofits. So I did that for about 10 years before I started working in the church. And so part of my passion and my calling in this work is to help bring some of the best practices from our secular nonprofits into the church where appropriate. And so we're going to talk about some of those ideas today. And just so you know, I'm also married to an Episcopal priest and rector. And so my experience is both grounded in my work with my clients, my own worship, and seeing what it takes to run a church every day. Now I'm living outside of Memphis. So if anybody's around in the Southeast, shout out. So what's our agenda for today? We did a little intro. That's already done. Yay. We're going to touch a little bit on who are millennials. You know, that's a term and a name that we throw around a lot without really defining it very clearly or understanding who we're talking about. And so I'm going to give you just some basic statistics about that group. And if you read our series on millennials and by millennials that Sandra just referenced, you probably know some of this information. You might already know it anyways. So I'll try and keep it brief, but I want to make sure we're all grounded in that same information. And then we're going to talk about feedback loops. Feedback loops are the main tool that I'm going to talk about today for trying to set goals and gather information from millennials so that we are planning our programs and our ministries with millennials' input in mind. If we want to attract millennials, we need to take their input into account to make sure our programs and our ministries are relevant and connect with them. So we're going to talk mostly about feedback loops as a way to gather that information and adapt and adjust. And then we're going to touch on specifically some suggestions for tools within the feedback loop concept that might connect particularly with millennials. We'll end with a final Q&A and a closing. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, if you're on Facebook or if you're live with us on Zoom, please do type in the chat box. I will try to watch them, but Sandra is there monitoring the chat, and I've told her to interrupt me at any point if there's a question that's relevant to what I'm talking about. I like to be engaging and have back and forth in my presentations, and so I know it's harder on a web format than it is in person, but please do type those questions in real time if you have them. So with that, let's dive in. So who are the millennials? They're born between 1981 and 1996. That is a pretty large time frame when you think about all the things that have happened in recent decades, all the developments and current events that have happened. So the millennials are the people that you see around the world in your day-to-day life in your pews, who are from about 23 to about 38. And take a moment to reflect on your own life. Between when you were 23, so maybe if you went to college, you might have been finishing college. If you didn't, you might be in your first job or two out in the world. You're really trying to figure yourself out still as an adult in the world. Up to late 30s, so almost 40. You might have had a family at that point, have started a family, have been married and have children. You might have been in several relationships and several jobs, depending upon what generation you are. But no doubt, between the age of 23 and 38, you had a lot of different experiences and perspective in your life. And so this is a large group of people with very different ages and perspectives and experiences, all within that same generation. It's over 70 million people at this point in time. All of our generations that we talk about are shaped by major events that happened in their youth and their coming of age. And so for this group, we saw increased connectivity in the world, but we also saw increased uncertainty, I think. The increased connectivity came through the advent of the internet, email, social media, cell phones, iPhones particularly, and increased uncertainty. We saw school shootings, we saw mass shootings, we saw 9/11, we've seen the war on terror, we've seen the Great Recession, so economic uncertainty as well as violence. Every generation has these major moments that affect them and shape them. And so these are the ones that have shaped this group. On whole, they are more educated, they have more debt, and they have a little bit less potential for upward mobility than prior generations. So more of them have gone to higher education, college, and beyond college. And the majority of the debt that they have is for that education. And again, less potential for upward mobility. You all know the story. We are no longer staying at corporations for 50 years and getting the gold watch. There is more of a struggle to find the steady job and to be as prosperous or more prosperous than our parents or their parents before them. This generation is later to get married, if they get married at all. And this generation is later to have children, if they have children at all. So a lot more different types of family situations than we had seen in prior generations, different choices around relationships and families than we have seen in prior generations. Most care the most about issues that are local and impact their daily lives. These are the folks that love going to the farmer's market and love going to farm-to-table restaurants and love volunteering for causes that are working in the neighborhoods that surround where they live. Yes, they have been raised and come to be adults in a world that is more connected and global than generations past. But while they have that mindset and that connectivity with the world, they are deeply focused on what is happening in their lives and around them. Some people perceive that as being self-centered or selfish. And I think that is a symptom we see of this generation being really focused on the life that is around them. They also really want to contribute with sweat equity. So that time and talent that we often talk about, we talk about time, talent, and treasure, the ways we contribute to the church and to nonprofits. And so they not only want to write a check, but they actually want to volunteer and want to be part of and feel like organizations are a part of them. And so this is something that is really important as we're thinking about how to create programs or ministries or invite them into existing programs and ministries, because they don't just want to show up. They don't just want to write a check. They want to be involved and they want to have skin in the game. So with that in mind, we'll keep talking a little bit more about how we do that. A few more facts and figures. Here is both of these charts that I'm about to show you are from Pew. That Pew is a wonderful resource for research on generations and differences between generations and statistics and things. So just to make sure we're all grounded, some of us are more visual learners. The generations that we have right now are our silent generation. It's the turquoise in both of those charts, the dark turquoise. We have then boomers, who are that light bluish line. We have Generation X, which is the light yellow. And then we have millennials, which is the gold. And so you'll see right now in this, in the chart on the left, that boomers are the largest. Sandra, don't interrupt me.
I am so sorry. Yes. We have one comment before you move on. From Jennifer, does that mean they are less likely to pledge?
So
thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what does that mean, but I'll go back a slide real quick so we can see.
I think it is when you were talking about the sweat and they want to be a part of not just giving but also being a part of it. Yes.
So because of the debt that they have and because that they're earlier in their careers, they might be established in a job, but they might be lower on the totem pole, or they might not be established in a real job with a good salary yet. Their giving capacity is smaller than other generations, right? They don't have as much wealth built and they have more debt. So they don't have as much to give. However, what we are seeing, and I wrote about this extensively in the article that I did for the Millennial series for Vital Practices, what we're seeing is that they're more likely to give if they volunteer, if they feel integrated into a nonprofit or into a church. And so they might not have as much to give, and it might take them a little bit longer to want to pledge, but the more deeply involved you can get them, the more likely they are to pledge. So they're not necessarily less likely to pledge. You just need to not assume they're going to pledge the second they walk in the door, right? They're more likely to pledge the more involved they get. And Sandra's just popped in the link for the article that I wrote. Thank you. So back to the stats, just quickly. So what we see right now is that we're right at the point where millennials are starting to be a little bit larger of a group in our population than boomers. Boomers have been the largest. And that's just because boomers are aging and people are starting to pass away. And so the millennials are about to, if not have already become the largest group in our population. And then as years progress, you see in 2028, Gen X surpasses boomers. And then in 2036, millennials will peak and they will start, passing away and not increasing, not being the largest anymore. The generation that we don't know about yet is Generation Z, and they are those that were born after 1997 to 2012. And we've had 7 years since 2012, and so there's a whole nother generation behind them that we don't have statistics or observations on yet. So just as you're thinking about the future, know that millennials are probably the largest group in our population right now. But as you know, they're not our largest groups involved in church. What we're seeing often at church is that the boomers are really the ones that are still in the leadership positions, whether it's vestry or committees, or altar guild chair or choir leader, all the different ministries that we do in church. Boomers are still leaders. And so we want to talk about ways to get millennials more engaged so that we can continue to build that leadership pipeline. Yes, Sandra.
Susan has her hand raised. I'm going to allow Susan to talk, if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Susan.
Looks like she might still be muted.
Yeah, I just saw it. Okay. It's still.
I think Susan can unmute herself.
I'm trying to unmute, yeah, but I can't for some reason. Susan, can you unmute yourself? Because for some reason I can't unmute you.
It will be down in the very bottom left corner, I think.
Yes. Or if you could please type in your question until we can figure that out. And so Sarah, you can continue until we figure this out, or until Susan can type in her question.
Got it.
Thank you.
Okay, so to engage our millennial perspective, what I'm going to advocate for today is to start to think about incorporating feedback loops into our planning for ministries, programs, outreach opportunities. And so if you look up feedback loops, you Google it, you do some research, what you're going to find is you start with a goal, and then you want to measure your success towards meeting that goal. And then you want to analyze the results of your measurements, discuss the options to how to adapt and adjust, and then adapt your strategies as needed to better meet that goal. And what I'm going to advocate for today is to add one preliminary step before simply setting a goal. Start by listening to those who are affected or targeted by the goal. And today we're specifically talking about millennials, but you can translate this into any situation that you want to. Often in the church, I think we get ideas about what we think is best and what we want to see, and we set a goal and we go after it. And with this generation, what I'm often seeing is people, particularly in capital campaign work that I've done and in listening sessions that I've participated in, people think that they know what this generation wants without actually asking them. This generation is much more traditional than many people think. There is a study done by Barna that I reference in the Millennial Giving article that we linked to in the comments section, that shows that millennials want a traditional looking church. They don't want to worship in an auditorium. Many don't want to worship in an auditorium. Many want that traditional experience. Whereas what I often hear is maybe we should try rock music to attract millennials, for example. Sandra, did you want to interject?
Yes, I'm so sorry again. Susan said, I am on the phone. My question is why greatest generation isn't even referenced. Still a force, even though not for much longer.
Yeah, so greatest and silent kind of overlap each other. There's a subset there, and so that's Pew's qualifications, the way that they the data that they had and the study that they used. And so if I have it correct, I think that silent generation is a subset of the greatest generation. But don't hold me to that. I might have that reversed. But they are related. And so, no, we are not overlooking our oldest parishioners that we have. So feedback loops. Start by listening to those who are affected and targeted by the goal. Then, based on that listening, what you learn from that listening, start to craft your goal and then move into the feedback loop. So what we have here, one of my sources that I linked to at the end, I grabbed this graphic from them. Here's a feedback loop. Your entry point is at this design and plan stage. Then you move to collecting data to measure how you're doing against your goal. You analyze, you communicate and discuss the results, and then you course correct. You adapt and adjust as needed. And it is a loop. So you go back to designing and planning. So when we start with this design and plan stage, I want to underscore that listening is an absolutely crucial piece of the design and plan stage. So here it is written out a little more. Using feedback loops to engage millennials. First, we want to listen. Use data collection tools to inform your goal. There are lots of data collection tools. You can be as formal or as informal as you want at this point. I think in the listening stage, it's often helpful just to have conversations. And from those conversations, then whoever's in charge, you know, this might be a vestry-led initiative. This might be that you're planning at your vestry retreat. You're setting your goals for the year. Or it might be a committee that's in charge of ministry or outreach. Whoever is setting the goal, they need to use that listening to inform their goal. Then you want to measure. So use data collection tools again to assess your progress against that goal. And here you might start using more sophisticated or more technological measurement tools. But again, it might also be low tech. I don't want to say that just because this generation has grown up with technology, that you have to use technology to communicate with them. They know how to use pencil and paper, just like everybody else does. And so when we get a little more in detail into the measure section, I'm going to suggest some high tech and some low tech tools for measuring. Next step, analyze. So anytime that you ask for feedback or you ask for input or you have listening sessions, you need to make sure you actually do something with that, right? The worst possible thing I think you can do in a process like this is to ask people for their input and feedback and then let it sit on a shelf and do nothing. That is one way to really burn trust. And so make sure you spend time digesting what was said. And figuring out what those trends are, what has risen up, what great ideas there are. Discuss, take those recommendations to the appropriate group, whether it's a clergy or a staff person heading up this initiative, a committee, or the vestry. And then as you're able, adapt and revise your plans and take action. And then it begins again. So listening. I love to use, in capital campaigns, we do an intentional phase of listening. And so a lot of my ideas about listening come from that work. Sandra, yes.
I hope I'm saying this right. Whitner, I'm not sure if that's how you say your name. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. Says, I am the only millennial in my church and so do not provide a great sample size. How can my church listen well to millennials who may not already be in church or at a different church? Great question. Thank you.
Awesome. So right now, you do matter if you're the only millennial, right? And so listening to you is a great jumping off point. Yes, you are one individual, so you cannot represent the entire generation. And anyone who is putting that pressure on you needs to take a step back, right? You're just one person. But your perspective is better than no perspective at all to get started from. So I would say having conversations with people who are in positions of leadership is important. So for all of us out there, you know, if you only have a couple of millennials, start by talking to them. And something might come out of that conversation that leads you to a great place to do more research. As I referenced earlier, there's a Barna study about worship style that shows trends in millennial preferences. You know, doing a quick Google search, you might find some great information that's relevant. to what this generation might have a perspective on an issue that you're asking about. But we have to start where we are. And so if there is only one, we have to start there, and you can do additional research online, or if there are, if there are volunteer groups or other groups that meet in your space, you could talk with those millennials, other millennials who don't go to your church. You could ask their ideas. But we have to work with the samples that we have and supplement that with research. Yeah, it's Patrick, I see your comment. It's Barna, B-A-R-N-A, and I linked to it in the article that Sandra posted a couple of comments up above. So you can click on that and find that study. Okay, so back to listening. When we listen, I think a great framework to start with to help shape your questions is a SWOT analysis. This is a concept from the business world where we assess what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So what does strengths mean? We start by asking someone, what do we already do well? Why are you here? What do you love about this church? Weaknesses, what could we be doing better? What do you think could be improved? Opportunities. Are there opportunities out in the community or within this congregation that you see that we could be meeting and we're not doing right now? This could be something that the community around the church needs, a new ministry with the community, or this could be a new element of worship, or it could be a new in-reach ministry, a new service within your congregation. So opening up that forum for people to say, well, I've been thinking about this thing that we don't do that I kind of wish we did. And then threats. Threats is, I don't love that word in this context, but it's the acronym that already existed. But so threats, the way I think of it is there anything else that's going on in the community that we should be aware of when we're thinking about setting our goals? We don't want to replicate efforts that are happening elsewhere if that's not appropriate, or we don't want to compete with other churches or organizations, etc. So here's a sample of how you could take those concepts and put them into questions. So let's say you've got one or two millennials in your church, and whoever's leading up this initiative wants to have a set of conversations with them to start to plan for your goal setting. So why do you attend our church? What brought you here? Why do you stay here? How connected do you feel into the life of our church right now? That could be a scale. You could say on a scale of 1 to 5, how connected do you feel right now? Just to understand, is this person really feel like they're already integrated? Does this group feel very integrated? Or do they feel like they're still on the margins? And what could we do to improve your response to the prior question? If they already feel connected, they might say nothing. And if they feel like they're on the periphery and want to be more deeply connected, they can give you some ideas. Or they might be the kind of person who wants to stay on the periphery, and that's okay too. What are a few new things we could offer or do that would make you more excited to become deeply connected? Is there a newcomer ministry that we could initiate or improve upon? Are you really passionate about playing the guitar and want to be able to do that in one of our worship services, or with the youth group? Leave that open-ended and see what comes out. And then finally, an open-ended question, that catch-all. What other ideas or suggestions do you have? And you have to be ready to hear anything when you ask a question like this. And so whoever is asking these questions and having these conversations needs to be someone who is open-minded and neutral, and is able to simply hear, and that the millennials that you're talking with will trust and open up to. And these kind of questions, these open-ended questions, can give you all sorts of information that might be helpful and relevant to the work at hand, and it might be additional information that's not related at all. But worst case scenario, you're building a relationship by opening this door and having this conversation. If you learn nothing else at all, I think that that's a wonderful benefit. So once you have conversations, some initial conversations, if you have a huge group of millennials, you could start with like a survey tool. But I suspect that identifying a handful of folks who are already, leaders or involved in some way and having that initial informal conversation with them will probably be helpful in thinking about setting a goal. So whenever I think about setting goals, I always go to the SMART goal format. I think that it helps you create really great goals. So what does SMART mean? I'm sure that you've probably encountered this before, but if you haven't, SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, sometimes assigned to, but I like attainable, relevant, and time sensitive. Diving a little deeper, specific. That means you want to think about what is it that you want to do, and think about those 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. We don't want to say lofty things when we're setting SMART goals. We want it to be very specific and focused. Measurable. Again, we're talking about measuring and feedback here. So how will we measure this goal? How will we know if we've succeeded? And what I hear in the church world is, even in the secular nonprofit world, is what we do can't be measured. Well, yes and no. You can measure what you set out to measure. And so if you set a goal that has a % in it or a number in it, and you'll see examples on my next slide, but then you'll be able to go back and say, did we succeed or did we not succeed? Or did we halfway succeed? We want to be able to measure what we've done in an appropriate way. Is it attainable? Is this really something you can do? I love dreaming big. I am a big dreamer and a big visionary. I love that kind of stuff. But we want to set goals that are attainable and realistic. They're not too visionary that will never have success. Relevant. Is your goal realistic and appropriate for your church? And does it directly relate to your mission, vision, and identity? So we're talking about millennials here. If you are a church that is set in a retirement community, I don't want you to set a goal that says we're going to have 100 millennials in our pew next year. That probably isn't realistic or attainable for your location, right? So think about who you are and what your identity is as you set those goals so that you are making your goals relevant. And the last one is time sensitive. Is there a deadline? Do you have a sense of time and urgency in your goal? Yes, Sandra.
Bob asks, in reaching millennials, both in church and not yet attending, which social media tools do you think are most effective reaching them? Facebook, Instagram, etc.
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. So hang on to that for me. I've got some suggestions of tools coming up a little bit later. Okay, so back to thinking about goals. Here are some examples of a SMART goal. We want to increase our millennial worship attendance by 10% in the next calendar year. Wherever you are, you might be at 1 person, you might be at 10 people, you might be at 100 people. Whatever that is, set a percentage that seems realistic, but also helps you aspire to something greater. So I put 10% in there. Involve at least 1 millennial in each active ministry team by June of next year. So that would mean, identifying who is there, who could be leaders, and recruiting them and engaging them. Create 1 new ministry by fall 2020 that is both conceived and led by millennials. So those are just examples. I don't know where your church is on your journey with millennials, and I don't know what your mission and your vision is. So think about where you are and what an appropriate SMART goal could be for your vision and your strategic plan. Okay, so just checking back in on where we are with the steps. We've talked about that initial listening, gathering information and some anecdotes to inform setting our goal. We've talked about how to set a goal using SMART goals. Now let's talk a little bit more about measuring progress towards those goals. So here is our answer to our question about some online tools, social media tools, and others. So there are tools that are both high tech and low tech that you can use to listen to your millennials, and millennials perhaps who aren't even there with you yet. These are all free. All it takes is time. So it's either a staff person's time, a clergy person's time, or a volunteer. Facebook has a tool where you can create polls. I love those. You can create a couple of different options and people vote. And then your data right there is aggregated. 10 people said this, 8 people said this, 0 people chose this choice. You can also just write a post and encourage people to respond in the comments. That's just like when you fill out a survey and there's an open-ended response section. It's exactly like that. We use Facebook posts at ECF all the time to gather feedback and input and comments. Google Forms is a great tool. So anyone who has a Gmail account, a Google account, has access to all of their myriad of tools and I don't even know what they're called, apps, I guess, within the Google suite. And one of their tools is Google Forms. And so you can create very easily a survey using their tools. And then on the back end, it will either aggregate or break out those responses for you. And so you can see every response in a pie chart or in a graph. And you can also get every response generated automatically into a spreadsheet. And that's a Google spreadsheet, but you can always export that into Excel to use in any way that you want to or need to. I use Google Forms a lot in my work because I like the reporting aspect. It generates nice images for you. It's free. You can ask as many questions as you want with no cost in Google Forms. And you generate a link, and then that's a link that you can share on a Facebook, or you can share in an e-newsletter, or anywhere that you want. SurveyMonkey surveys work very much the same way. SurveyMonkey is a little bit more sophisticated, and its reporting on the back end is a little bit more sophisticated than Google Forms. But their free version only allows you to do 10 questions, and I believe it's 100 responses. And so if you have more than 10 questions you want to ask, or you have a large sample size that you're surveying, SurveyMonkey, the free option might not be the best for you. They do have paid options too, which again, we use at ECF for work with our clients because we need to reach large groups of people and ask lots of questions. So it's worth it for us, but it might not be worth it for you in this context. You just have to decide. And another fun, really quick feedback mechanism that I love is Instagram story polls. So if you have an Instagram account that has a lot of followers and folks are really engaged with, you can create a poll in a story and people just click. And part of what this generation does is they have their cell phone all the time, and they're scrolling and they're clicking while they're waiting for the subway, or they're waiting for the bus, or they're in the doctor's office, or it's illegal a lot of places while they're sitting at a stoplight. And at every moment, the phone is never far. And so those quick things, like a Facebook poll or an Instagram poll where you can just click and give your feedback, those are great tools. Low tech, also free, except for the cost of, paper or volunteer or staff time. Interviews and conversations. We talked about that during the listening portion. And so if you don't have a lot of people that you're trying to get to and talk to, simply having face-to-face conversations can often be one of the most effective tools. It doesn't generate charts and graphs in a neat, beautiful way to pop into PowerPoint presentations, but you might not need to do that. You can also do paper forms. Anytime we do surveys with ECF, we often have a paper form that supplements it, so that if folks don't like technology or don't want to use technology, they can use a paper form. If you want to catch people as they're walking out of church on Sunday, handing out a paper form is a great way to go. You can ask them to put it back into the offering plate, or ask them to put it in the basket in the Sunday school classroom. Ask them to mail it in. Paper forms, I wouldn't discount face-to-face and paper low-tech solutions with this generation just because they are familiar with and comfortable with technology. That doesn't mean that they don't want lower tech solutions and ways to measure, because it helps. Having a conversation or being interviewed by one of your clergy people or a vestry member or another leader in the church is flattering and exciting. And sometimes it's nice to have face-to-face contact with people in a world where we are so focused on technology. So I encourage you, when you think about measuring your progress towards your goal, how are we doing at increasing our millennial worship by 10% in 2020? Or how are we doing at engaging millennials in leadership positions in the church? Think about using a mix of low-tech and high-tech feedback tools to try and catch people, in the different ways that they like to communicate. So we asked for input as we were thinking about planning for this webinar. So here is an example right here of us using a Facebook tool to ask a question. So we asked, how are you gathering feedback and listening to millennials? And we heard from one of our followers, we hired one. We actually hired two, and we engaged them in an updated music format and loved the process. So in this congregation, they said, we're going to be able to attract and listen to millennials if we have millennials on our staff who can bring that perspective every day and perhaps have that network and that feedback that they can use in making decisions going forward. I love that one. We heard from another of our followers that she meets individually with her parishioners. So what I've been talking about, sometimes those low tech connections are some of the best. So she listens to them, and from those conversations, she's created some different Bible study options and discussion groups that are at times of day that suit this group. So the way that they had always done it was having courses on weeknights, and that didn't work for her millennial parishioners, she learned. And so how exciting is it that she's found a niche, something that they want. They've asked for Christian formation opportunities. They've asked for them at a different time that suits their schedule. And it sounds like she's having success, and that everyone is having a deeper experience in worship and formation because of it. So these are just two great success stories that we heard. We use one of the free feedback tools so that I could show you an example here. And then we heard two success stories of what's happening in the real world out there with engaging millennials. So we've talked about listening. We've talked about setting a goal. And we've talked about measurement using both high-tech and low-tech solutions, and hopefully all free or low cost to you. The next 3 steps in using a feedback loop are analyzing the results, discussing the results with the appropriate team members, leadership groups at your church, and adapting your solutions to meet that goal, whether it's revising the goal or adapting the way that you're going about the goal. And I can't dive too much deeper into those last 3 steps because it's really going to depend on what you learn. But you do have to be, as I said in the beginning, really intentional. If you're going to engage in this work, which I think everyone should, you have to analyze the results. You have to communicate the results to the appropriate leadership groups and then back to the congregation, frankly, to let them know that you have been listening and that you are responding. And then you have to take action with what you learned. Adapt and adjust. Again, whether it's readjusting the goal, if you learn that the goal was not appropriate or not attainable, or if you learned that your time sensitivity was too narrow or too large, adapt. You might achieve your goal really quickly, and so you need to think of a bigger goal, or you might struggle with achieving the goal, and so you need to totally rethink it. But you have to take those last 3 steps because if you ask for feedback and then let it die, it is detrimental to the relationships and the trust that you have tried to forge by listening in the first place. And then I want to remind you about this last arrow. Okay, it's a cycle. This isn't a one-time thing. You can't say, oh yeah, we did that. We set a goal in our strategic plan 5 years ago, and we did that survey, and we learned this thing, and we did it. Well, great. It's been 5 years. So what's next? And 5 years, I would say, is even a long time horizon in this day and age for setting goals. So is it every year at your vestry retreat, you set 1 or 2 goals and you have feedback loops to measure them? Is it every couple of years? Again, these, particularly with relating to millennials, they are between the ages of 23 and 38 right now. And so a lot changes in a person's life in their 20s and their 30s. And so stay relevant and stay connected with them as they age, and do this work in an ongoing way in a timely manner, because they are at that point where their lives change so much, and people move around so much. So we talked about some additional reading. I referenced where I got that initial graphic from. It's this Get to Growth article, which is really, it's pretty academic about feedback loops, you know, and it has lots of steps and terms and things. And so if you would like to know more about the technical side of feedback loops than we were able to touch on in about 50 minutes, click on that link and go to that article, because it has, I think it's really useful and helpful and accessible as well. Engaging Millennials is one of the articles that was written as part of our Millennials series that I thought was a very helpful perspective, written by a millennial about how to engage millennials. So that's great additional reading as well. And then another article from one of my capital campaign colleagues about some great examples of how they used younger folks. She calls it calling kids to communications, but it's some millennial, some Gen Z, so a little bit younger than millennial too, but it's examples of how to use millennial talent and sweat equity in improving your communications and the measuring portion of that feedback loop, the listening and communicating. I didn't link to my own article. I didn't think about that, but Sandra gave it to you in the comments. So you have that. The article that I wrote is specifically focused on fundraising with millennials and what their capacity to give is and their preferences to give are. It touches a little bit on technology versus non-technology as well. And so that that's additional reading that's tangential to this topic, I'd say. So I'm going to pause now and say we're getting toward the end of our hour together. What additional questions or comments do you have? Do you have questions about things that I said? Or do you have a success story that you'd like to share with the group? We're going to pause for a moment, and if you're on Facebook, type it into the comments, and if you're on Zoom, type it into the chat box. And
I also wanted to say that we will be posting, of course, this video on our YouTube channel, ECF Videos, and which will have a link to the slides. If you signed up for this webinar, you will also get an email with the slides attached to the link to the video. And if you did not sign up, you can either send me at, I typed up my email address, smontes, M-O-N-T-E-S, at episcopalfoundation.org. You can email me and ask me for the slides. We will be happy to send them to you. And Sarah will also share on her last slide, well, the next one right here, where you can email us to ask for the slides also.
Okay, so I see a question. If you're not tracking ages currently, what's the best way to try and get those birthdays into your system? That's a good one. You know, you could do an all parish survey and ask people to check a checkbox for what generation they're in. And you could put in parentheses, you know, born between year X and year Y. That's a great way to gather data. You just would have to make sure that, you know, you did everything to reach as many people as possible. That's what I would suggest, whether it's a paper survey or an online survey, but including some demographic information like the generation as well as contact information could be helpful. You know, I don't know what kind of database system you have, if there's a field where you can add that. But that's how I can think of offhand to gather that information. Let's see, I'm trying to keep up with comments.
Mary Ellen, thank you so much for your comments. She just wants to say thank you. Joy says, how often might millennials want to come to church programs?
I think you have to ask them. Depends. I am currently at the point where I have a young child, and so I love to come to our young family events outside of worship on Sunday. I love any excuse to get my daughter out and socialize her and be with other families. So I love to go to church. If I, you know, rewind a couple years and maybe I had other interests and other things that I did out in the community, and so I only attended worship on Sundays. You know, you really have to ask, I think, depending upon a life situation and frankly, the setting of your congregation. Are you suburban? Are you urban? This is a great example of you have to ask.
Yes.
I just told you my perspective, but I'm just one person.
You're welcome, Patrick. Jennifer says, what would you think of having a millennial liaison who attended ministry planning meetings, someone who could provide feedback to the ministries to help shape communications, etc.? Since boomers are typically in leadership roles, I am not sure millennials are being heard in my parish. Yeah.
So, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a millennial liaison. That feels a little bit marginalizing to me. Why don't you create a spot on a committee and invite a millennial to be a committee person? You know, and not just a token millennial, someone who really cares about that ministry and that committee. Oftentimes asking people to serve as a leader is incredibly flattering. Particularly for this generation loves mentoring relationships. And so if they can be put in a place where they are surrounded by other experienced leaders and can learn from them, I think that's a great opportunity. A lot of churches have youth slots on their vestry. So it could be a similar type. But I just, something in me says, I don't know that I would call it a millennial liaison, but again, that might just be my personal preference. I would just add a millennial person to the committee.
Bradley says, to what extent do churches need to be engaged in presenting a reason to go to church? As a millennial, I know a lot of friends and peers who just don't want or need church.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, that's a question about evangelism. I think we have to train, we have to do a better job in the Episcopal Church of training our parishioners to be evangelists, parishioners of all ages, but particularly our millennials, giving them the tools to be able to talk about their faith and why they love their church and why they love Jesus and follow Jesus, and do that by going to church on Sundays and participating in ministries and programs. We have to be able to tell those stories. And so and I don't think we do a good job of that for all of our generations. I think in many churches that is a skill set that we are not comfortable with. And so if there is an evangelism curriculum or class or conversation that you want to have in your parish, that you want to gear particularly towards millennials and building their skill set for evangelism, I think that could be a really powerful way for millennials to feel comfortable inviting their peers to church with them. But there are going to be people who are not ever going to go to church, and so we can't get everyone. But we have to be able to tell our stories and tell our faith journeys in order to show people why it is important to us. So that's a whole conversation about evangelism that I think we could have, and I'm probably not the best person to lead it.
And Anne says, we are not a parish, but a diocesan-wide nonprofit doing important poverty fighting work, which should be appealing to millennials, but with fewer millennials going to church, we are having trouble finding them. How do we find people who self-identify as Episcopalians and may want this as a church alternative, a way to feel like they are still involved and spiritual without a Sunday service?
The first idea that comes to my mind when I see that is if this is a diocesan wide nonprofit, is there a way that you can access the diocesan communications to reach more folks? If people are not, some people might not belong to a parish or actively go to worship, but might still follow the diocesan newsletters or the diocesan Facebook. And so if you can get them to start putting in little blurbs in the newsletter, or do a Facebook post or an Instagram post about your work, that could be a way to connect with them. Social media. All you have to do is ask your followers to share your page or one of your posts on social media. I'm not as familiar with Snapchat or anything other than Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. But if you ask your followers to share your page with a little testimonial about why they love being involved, that's the power of the network right there. This generation has been connected on social media since college or high school or earlier. And so they really have never lost touch with anyone unless they wanted to. Not like other generations where once they get on social media, they're re-finding people. Many in this generation never lost touch with people. And so asking them to share on social media your cause, whether it's this nonprofit we're talking about or your church, asking them to share is a wonderful way to use their network to help share your mission.
And Bob agrees. I think it says, for diocesan millennial recruiting question, consider Facebook targeted ads where you can target by location, income, interests, deliver your message to those who are likely to be interested in your program's projects.
Yeah, we do. An example is at my church for the last couple of Christmases, when it gets to be close to Christmas services. We know a lot of people love to only go to church at Christmas, right, and don't have a church home. So we put out a Facebook ad about the week before Christmas with all of our services. So that's just one example. And yes, you can target very specific. You can target, Facebook has an incredible degree of specificity that you can use to target your ads if you want to. Thank you for saying that. That was great.
Yes, and Whitner, I think, is kind of saying what you were saying too, Jennifer. Just as the term millennial liaison could be marginalizing, the term youth vestry member could also be marginalizing. If you want a millennial to have a voice in shaping all of your ministries, I recommend inviting a millennial to be a full member of the vestry. I am on vestry at my church and feel both heard and valued. That's awesome.
Thank you.
So any other questions? I really, three of my takeaways, I'm sure I have a lot more, but I really love when you spoke about trust. When we do ask people, when we do put them, in like the seat of where we're learning from them, we really can build trust. It's so important to ask millennials what it is that they are looking for. And that it is a cycle, right? You said not just a one-time thing, but it is a cycle where we continue to do this work of church and of love with everybody, where everybody can feel welcome and heard and celebrated at our churches. So again, you will have these slides if you signed up for the webinar. If not, there's our contact information. There's Sarah's information as well. And mine is just S as in Sandra, and then Montes, M-O-N-T-E-S, at episcopalfoundation.org. We thank you all so much for being with us. And especially Sarah, thank you so much for your insights and for, this great work that you're doing. So thank you. Joy says, I am excited about listening better to millennials and welcoming them to join us. Awesome. Thank you so much. And, remember that at ecfvp.org, you can find the millennial issue, which was May and June, with incredible insight from, music to evangelism to finance, all by millennials. And it was just a joy to read all of those incredible blogs and articles, including Sarah's. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see y'all again in another webinar. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.